Hello. My intention today is just to show off some of the more attractive but also sometimes more interesting things that we have in the archive. And I'll touch on the college history at various points as we go along as well. So the college, I'll say a bit more about the foundation of the college, but as Dan says, we're sort of part of a new college. We're almost 500 years old. So the official founding date is 1555, and I'll say a bit more about why it's official later. But it might surprise you to think that there has actually been a formal archive in the college since the very beginning. And if we go back to the original college statutes, and these were put together in 1562, this is the formal rules for the archive laid out in the statutes of why an archive should be kept. So to give you an English translation, it is that evidences, charters, muniments and other writings should be kept so that the men of our college, when challenged to suits and arms, may be always ready and not march to the pitched battle unarmed. Now that's a bit of the statutes that the college lifted, that the founder lifted from the statutes of Corpus Christi College, which was founded in 1517, and basically throughout the rest of the 16th century, everybody founded in the college largely just took their statutes and adapted them where necessary on the basis of why reinvent the wheel. But what this is talking about, of course, is the pitched battle referred here means the law courts. So that basically we should be keeping the archives, evidences, charters, muniments, so that should somebody challenge us about something that grants the college an income or a privilege or something, then we could find the evidence to prove that the college was right and not have this taken away from us. So that was the original idea of the archive, and still works like that to some extent, in that we do frequently, I mean just yesterday we were dealing with things for the people who manage the college estates, although we also deal with various other things as we'll come to towards the end of the talk, things that we have relating to students from a more modern period are particularly interesting. We have a lot of people who write to us and say, I think my great-grandfather went to the college, what can you tell me about him? So we have a much larger remit than this, but that still remains part of what we do. And this is also a reminder with muniments. When I started work here over 20 years ago, the archive was in what was very much at the time called the muniment room. And this is a reminder with the pitched battle here that muniments and munitions have the same root. They are both weapons to some extent. And originally, the archive would have been kept in the gate tower, which I imagine most of you entered the college through today. There was always a danger of fire when you put things in the second story of a tower, but it was, of course, a nice large stone building, which would minimise the chances of a fire catching. But the main reason, it was security, because to get to the archive, you had to march through the bursar's office on the floor below. And it stayed there for several centuries until in the middle, just after the Second World War, in about 1950 or so, it was moved into the basement of the senior common room, which is in North Quad. We moved out of there in 2003 so that that space could be turned into a kitchen. We briefly were in St Giles House, which is the very grand building further up St Giles, just up from the Lamb and Flag, in the basement there for 10 years. We moved out of there. Again, that was then turned into a kitchen. I let you draw your own conclusions about the college's priorities. But we did then move actually into a really, if you get a chance to go and see Kendrew Quad, which is our newest quad, and right at the far north of the college, good 5 minutes walk from here. And we were able to plan and build a purpose-built archive in there with all the right conditions and security measures and everything. So that's where we are now. But going back to the statutes of 1562, here is the front page, which is one of the more attractive, beautiful, attractive things that we have in the archive. So the college was founded by Sir Thomas White, who was a leading merchant and a leading member of the Merchant Tailors Company, one of the London livery companies. And it was founded under the reign of Queen Mary, Mary I, the eldest daughter of Henry VIII, who some of you might know as Bloody Mary, from her attempt to re-Catholicize the country. And this college and Trinity College, which was founded in the same year, were very much part of that project to re-Catholicize the country after Henry VIII's break with Rome. So the idea was that you would train up Catholic clergymen who would then drive that process forward. Of course, 1558, Mary dies, Elizabeth comes to the throne, the whole project stalls, and the college officially conforms, but it's still full of a lot of people who are probably best described as crypto-Catholic, a dozen of whom definitely converted to Catholicism, and I would say just as many were thinking about it and decided in the end their conscience could allow them to stay within the Church of England. And I mention this because this picture is rather interesting. First of all, we get the college coat of arms, which if you look around you at various points in the college, you'll see that in nice pedestals, sometimes even on drain pipes around the college. And this is the coat of arms of Sir Thomas White himself, hence the TW. And then above it is this rather attractive picture. The first thing to observe is that the two figures are in a slightly different ink than the rest of it, so were presumably done at a slightly different time. And also on the figure on the right, there is some evidence of alteration. So this is parchment, and it looks to me as if the parchment's been scraped, the ink's been scraped off the parchment a bit, and another attempt has been made to draw a different face. We can only speculate as to why that is, but this is a quite interesting picture because it's not at all clear who these people are meant to represent. Now, one option, you'll see immediately beneath it in Latin, to the honour of the Holy and Undivided Trinity. So perhaps this is the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. The Son is looking quite androgynous. God the Father is certainly not formally dressed. So that may or may not be it. So another possibility, if we look at the dress of the definitely male figure, is this could be John the Baptist in his 40 days in the wilderness. And perhaps this is meant to be Queen Elizabeth on the right. Another alternative, given what I've just told you about how the college was founded, this may be her half-sister Queen Mary, and then the other figure being that very often forgotten English king, King Philip I of England, better known to us as King Philip II of Spain, who on marrying, so he became king on marrying Mary in just the same way that a century and a half later William III became king after marrying another Mary Stuart rather than Mary Tudor. But when she died, he stopped being king. He then attempted to become king again, but by marrying Elizabeth, who wasn't interested, and then ultimately he burned his boats is an unfortunate phrase, but sent the Armada, the Spanish Armada, on failing to become king again. But for 4 years, I think, he was king of England, and so maybe this is Mary and Philip. And I suspect the whole point is that it's ambiguous. It's not clear. You can look at this from whatever your perspective on the religious division of the past 20 years and happily see what you want in it without anybody being able to execute you for it, in effect. So you can make your own opinions on that. On a more practical level, the statutes are interesting because at the bottom of every page, we have the signature, here is by me, Thomas White, Knight and Alderman. So there is the founder's signature. If you're not used to 16th century handwriting, this is something called secretary hand. What's particularly confusing, I don't know if this will work, you can see the H of Thomas and the H of White both drop beneath, are sort of tilted slightly and go beneath the line. And that's perfectly normal for the way H is always done in this particular handwriting of the period, but looks rather odd to modernise. But that, I assure you, that does say Thomas White. And although he has added knight and alderman here on that front page, on other pages he just writes by me, Thomas White, always at the bottom of the right-hand page. Here we see he's also adding things in the marginalia to say that this line that has been missed out and added, he's authorising that. He's saying this is a genuine thing. I haven't got a picture of this, but at times he also says vacat by me, Thomas White, saying that this bit that's been deleted is authorised, is official, and is definite. And I think what he's also doing by adding the bits at the bottom, those of us here who are old enough to remember writing cheques, and you always had to put the bit in order that nobody added a zero or added an extra £10 or whatever to what you'd written. I think he's basically sort of doing this to show that nothing else can be added beneath the line without his authority. If we go back to here, we can see another signature down here which says John Beerblock Scriptor. So John Beerblock is the man who has created this. And he was a fellow of the college who was actually nominated by the founder, quite possibly for this purpose to some extent. And he remained in the college until 1566 when he moved to Exeter College. And 1566 is when he produced his most famous work, when Queen Elizabeth visited Oxford for the first of, only I think 2 times did she come. And the universe and the Chancellor, which was her, let's say friend and colleague, Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester, to put it diplomatically, as Chancellor showed her around, and she was presented with a book that showed all the colleges and buildings of Oxford with some verses, and John Beerblock was responsible for the drawings. Oh, I forgot, here he has signed another Johannes Beerblockers. He signed one of the initial letters in there with his own name as well. But here, this is, the manuscript's in the Bodleian, but I've taken the pictures from a really good facsimile version of it by that one can purchase, and has by Louise Durning edited it, of Lincoln College. And this is St John's, because at this time, of course, only front quad plus the kitchen on the side of it existed. So there's no Canterbury quad beyond it, nothing to the north of it, just this one quadrangle. But Beerblock is best known probably for his picture of the Divinity School, which, if that looks familiar, it's because with very few changes, it remains the branding for the Bodleian today. So if you buy anything there, you'll get a carrier bag with this on it. He also added, it must be said only at the opening pages, he gets less interested as the statutes go on, of course, but he adds some nice things here like this face in one of the initial letters. That's definitely not the founder. We don't know who it is. It may be a Beerblock self-portrait, given that it's talking about, this is a statute about the president's oath. Maybe it's the president of the time. We don't know, but it's rather nice. And then one gets another initial letter with Jesus Johanni Faveat. So Jesus favoured John, which is quite nice, except, of course, the John in question is the evangelist rather than the Baptist. So it's the Cambridge version rather than our version of St John. But there we are. It's nice to have it anyway. One thing I do want to show you physically is this. So when I came here 20 years ago, this is what the statute book was kept in, with a little pouch for the seal. I sort of fondly imagine that this was perhaps made by the wife of President Winter, who I'll come to later, in the mid-19th century, from some old fabric in some old curtains or something from the President's lodgings. But I have been told by an expert that it probably does date to the mid to late 19th century. So maybe that's true. We've now got it in a rather splendid wooden box, which is by far the most expensive container we have in the archive because this is such an important thing. But we keep this as a bit of the history of the item. So we've talked about the foundation statutes. Now let's come to what we call the first foundation deed. And if I cut off the seal, you can get a better look at it. A note again by me, Thomas White, across the bottom. So this is a deed of 29th of May 1555, which is basically what we take as the foundation date of the college. And this is definitely when the college comes into legal existence. But you'll notice that I called it the first foundation deed because we also have the second foundation deed, which is from the 5th of March 1558, so almost 3 years later. Again signed by the founder, but it's hidden behind the seal folder here. And the reason why we have two foundation deeds is that actually this dates the time when the college was really functioning. So if we go back, what he's doing here is he nominates 3 fellows of the college and then adds in a 4th one between the lines and basically transfer to them all the properties which are listed down here, which are mostly in the Vale of the White Horse, which some of you might know, places like Fifield, Long Wittenham, Shillingford, Warborough. And he basically gives these properties to these 4 fellows. So what he's doing is he's creating what in modern terms we would call a trust. So the idea is that should he die before the college is up and running, then all of the property and all the money used to found the college is given to these 4 fellows. And probably the reason why he settled on 3 originally is the old legal idea that 3 people makes a corporation. So it becomes a legal corporate entity, in effect, with them. And then almost 3 years later, when the college is actually up and ready to open its doors, he basically does exactly the same again. But this time he nominates a whole lot more fellows. One name that just sticks out because it's sort of in the black, Gregory Martin, who would later be the main translator of the Douay-Rheims Bible, which is the first Bible officially authenticated by the Catholic Church to be in English. So again, that just gives you a nice idea of some of the people I was talking about earlier, who are sort of crypto-Catholics. So these people are all nominated by the founder, and again, he basically is just transferring the land to them for the purposes of creating the college. So you might think that as these are the foundation deeds, these are the earliest things we have in the archive. But we actually have older material because when we acquired some of these properties, you get all the previous deeds with them. So we have about 200 medieval deeds in the archive, which sounds impressive, but Magdalen has something like 13,000. But still, it's rather nice to have 200 or so. And the earliest of which purports to be this deed. And again, if I get rid of the seal, you can see it up front. Now, this is a deed of Robert de Oily at the top, who is the son of another Robert de Oily who fought at the Battle of Hastings and was given Oxford Castle by the Conqueror. The younger Robert is apparently giving to the canons of St George, which was the chapel in the castle, lands in North Oxford. And when the college acquired most of what we call North Oxford today in 1569, this would have been one of the deeds that came with it. Now, if you were listening very carefully, I said this purports to be the oldest deed, and it is, in fact, a forgery. And it's partly people who, I'm not a medievalist, so people who know this thing tell me that just doesn't look like 12th century. It claims to be from about 1120, by the way. And this is not writing of 1120. And also one of the witnesses is Galfredo Arthur. Now, you might know him better as Geoffrey of Monmouth, who wrote the history of the kings of England, which popularised, possibly invented, Arthur and Merlin. And as well as being, one could say historian, I'd be more tempted to say a professional novelist. He was also almost a professional witnesser of deeds. But at the time he supposedly witnessed this deed, he was dead. And what's happened is that in the 1120s, the way you legally transferred a piece of property, when this was called livery of season, is you would take a piece of dirt out of the ground and you would give it to the person you're selling it to. And that's the legal transfer. And then what you might or might not do is you might produce a witness to this and produce a deed. So in the 12th century, you might have deeds, you might not. By the 13th century, when the monks of Osney have acquired this property, it's much more normal to have a deed. And presumably they panicked slightly about the fact they didn't have a deed for this property, and they knew that legally it was theirs and legally it was fine, and so they created this deed to cover their backs, basically. And there's another one in Christchurch Archive, which is the same. And interestingly, the seal is genuine. So the wax was almost certainly impressed in the 13th century, but they somehow had the actual seal matrix, the metal that you press into it, is genuinely the seal matrix of the younger Robert d'Oyly. So they forged the deed and then sort of created a genuine seal to authenticate it. So that probably isn't, well, that definitely isn't our early deed. It's still a very early medieval deed. It's just a 13th century deed pretending to be a 12th century one. But what is probably, if I just go back, you'll see one of the witnesses is Walter Archdeacon, and one of what's probably our genuine earliest deed is this one, in which that same Walter, the Archdeacon of sorry, I'm just trying to find it in my notes, of Oxford, gives the tithe to St Giles Church. And this is generally about 1150. So almost 1,000 years old, actually. I hadn't thought about it like that. And you can see there is a seal here, which they have sewn a little bag around it to protect the seal. That would have been done certainly 500, if not 900 years ago. There's also interesting, I hadn't noticed this until early this morning, somebody's done a little bit of attempted restoration there. These days we would use Japanese paper, which is this very thin but very strong paper, largely invisible to do that, but they've tried to stitch it together. This is massively, as you might guess, oversized. The actual genuine size of it is that. So it is absolutely tiny. So I thought it'd be nice to move on to our next document, which is about that big. So one extreme to the other. This is what's called letters patent, which is a deed issued by the monarch. In this case, it is a grant from Philip and Mary, dated 1st of May 1555, so just 28 days before the foundation deed, and this is royal permission to found the college and confirming the various endowment properties that the founder has acquired. This is, I think, just a single sheet. Sometimes we've got one which is 6 of these sewn together, and this is an early big conservation project I did early in my time here. So they're called letters patent because it's taken from the Latin pateo, to open. And so the idea is, unlike letters closed, which were letters as we would think of, where the monarch sends a letter to the sheriff or something saying, please do this, and it's a piece of business, this is meant to be a presentation thing. Far too often one sees them hanging in solicitors' offices these days, but they were meant to be impressive and to be able to show off to people, and so by the 16th century, this sort of decoration at the top is standard. You generally have the monarch sitting enthroned in the initial letter, and here, of course, we have Philip and Mary together again. And at the bottom, this obviously is slightly damaged. You have the Great Seal, which is the seal that the Lord Chancellor has in his or her possession. And again, tradition states that on the front you have the monarch. It's just Mary on her own here, sitting enthroned. And on the back of it, you have the monarch on horseback. And you could tell this is a queen because Mary is sitting side saddle. This used to be the monarch going to war, but Henry VIII, I don't think I can see it here, but Henry VIII added a greyhound and so turned it from a war scene to a hunting scene, which I think is what we have here, because you wouldn't, of course, have a queen actually going to war. So I would have said, even today, about half of the items we have in the archive are to do with the management of the college's estates. And we still own various farms, fewer residential properties than we used to a century ago, but some commercial properties. We even own one football team's training ground. So the estates side is still an important way the college gets income. And somebody who recently joined the bursary recently put it in me, he thought he was joining an educational institution, but in fact had joined a property developer that does a bit of teaching on the side, which from the perspective of the bursary and the archive perhaps has some truth to it. But one of the things we have as part of the estates management are some maps. A lot of them are simply, map experts would get annoyed by my use of that word because they get very excited about ordnance survey maps. But we have a lot of ordnance survey maps over time with college properties coloured in, which can be quite useful for seeing when various things were purchased and when they were sold. But I'm just going to show you some of our early maps. So this one is a very early one. This is from 1600. You don't really get estate maps very commonly until the 18th century. But this one is just a nice sort of sketch drawing. So I'm sure many of you know of Bagley Wood near Radley. But basically, a part of that endowment that we saw on the foundation deeds was part of Bagley Wood that the founder purchased for us for entirely practical reasons that basically meant that the college had a permanent source of timber for building and firewood, and that we wouldn't have to go out and buy them from anyone else. And so this is an early plotter of Bagley Wood in 1600, which is rather pleasant, I think. Slightly grander is this map of Wasperton in Warwickshire. So a fellow called Richard Rawlinson, and you can, if you're going to the hall, you'll see there are two portraits of him in hall, and also if you go into the chapel, you can see an urn that holds his heart. He and his brothers had no children, so he left. When he died in the 1750s, he left the college his estate, basically because we were the one institution he had a connection to that he hadn't yet fallen out with. If you look at his portrait, it does look like he's sucking on a lemon. A fairly miserable character. But he was one of our greatest benefactors, so I should be very nice about him. But this is actually a slightly earlier map that was made by his father of the estate in 1686. So there are two farms in the yellow and green there that I think we still own today. But what's also rather nice, this is done at slightly different times with slightly different lighting, but it is the same map. You can see the coat of arms there and also the family house, of which they've obviously sort of added as a bit of pride to their more functional map. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the college bought when the founder died, he instructed that we should sell his property in London, which sounds like a shame now. It would have been worth a lot of money, but to use the money to buy land closer to the college. And we did purchase St Giles Field, which is now basically what we call North Oxford. So it was a fairly decent deal, as it's the sort of second most valuable property outside London. Basically, there are a few gaps, which I'll illustrate in a minute, but basically, if you walk to the Marston Ferry Road, most of the land there once belonged to the college. It's all mostly sold off half a century ago. To answer one of the questions that I suspect one of you might ask me at the end, as we get this a lot, is it true that you can walk from Oxford, or you could go from Oxford to Cambridge without leaving St John's property? Well, at the height of our property ownership, the furthest you could get to Cambridge without leaving St John's property was the Marston Ferry Road. Sorry to disappoint anybody on that one. But we have some rather nice maps of the land in question. So this is a map of 1769. So north is this way, so it's got west at the top. And this is a map of the parish of St Giles. So it's basically North Oxford and Summertown together. And sort of the key to it is that if a piece, and you can still see in many cases the old sort of medieval strip system, pre-enclosure, with these tiny little strips of land sort of down here, say. And the idea is that if the border is coloured, then it belongs to the college, and if it's grey, it doesn't. So you have this long stretch into Summertown in the middle and various bits down here that the college never owned. But you can see a nice bit here shown. So the college itself, so the old bits, sort of Canterbury Quad and Front Quad, are in the parish of St Mary Maggs. So the college, the original bit of the college was here. And as you can see, bits of the college going into North Quad and where we are, and Kendry Quad, didn't even belong to the college, bits of them. But you can see the college garden there. I think probably, I was trying to work this out earlier, where we are now, I'm not quite sure if it's in what was the garden there or in the bit belonging to the president, because I think that bit belonging to the president must be the President's Drive, which is right down beside us here. What I also quite like about this, and just to give you a nice bit of it, is a large part of lands where the Duke of Marlborough is our tenant, which I quite like. And in fact, I mentioned St Giles House earlier. He actually rented that from us as well as his sort of Oxford townhouse. So he could stay in some grandeur when he was in Oxford. So I'm now going to jump on a century to another map of North Oxford. So this just shows the southern part of it. This actually does have the college, and you can also see St John Street and Beaumont Street here. So it's a bit more than the parish of St Giles. This map was drawn up in 1871, but appears to have been updated through to the 1920s and even the 1930s from the editions that I've seen added. The size of the map, it's at least that in width. It might be longer than I can manage. And I wouldn't be at all surprised if it was rolled out fully, that it would be most of the length of this room. I don't think I've ever had it rolled out fully because I just haven't had the space to do it. So it is absolutely enormous. And in fact, we had a big project last year or the year before, I forget, to actually have this conserved. Because there have been quite a bit of damage where the various bits of it were attached together. But basically the code for it is that if it's red, it's a residential building. If it's black, ignore the college building in this sense. If it's black, it's an outhouse. And if it's yellow, which one can see occasionally, here's one in the college, that's a greenhouse. So this is the amount of detail the map is done to. That's probably, and you just see my fingers at the top, which gives you a sense of scale, that this is probably, I would have said, more or less life-size, what we're seeing there. If we move to a bit further to the north, one of the splendid things about this is that there are bits here like Parktown, which never was one part that never belonged to the college. You've got a bit here which is Univ, which I think is now Staffordtonia, their residential student annex. And if it didn't belong to the college, it simply doesn't exist, as far as we're concerned. It's just blank. And this was basically a management tool that I think probably hung on the bursary wall for best part of a century. What you can also see from here, as you could just looking on Google Maps, is the college's social engineering when developing North Oxford in the second half of the 19th century. And on this side, you can see what the college called the villas, which all had sort of rooms in the attic for servants and things, and are now largely language schools and the like because nobody can afford to live in them anymore. And then on the other side, you can see like Hayfield Road at the top there, the terrace housing, which the college called artisan housing. And so there's definitely an east-west divide in the way North Oxford was planned right from the very beginning. So moving on from maps, one other colourful thing we have are pedigrees. So if we go right back to those statutes, the founder laid down there will be 50 fellows. 43 of them would go to pupils from certain schools. Most of them the Merchant Taylors' School in London. But there would be 6 places reserved for what are known as founders' kin. So basically, the founder didn't have any children, otherwise his wealth would have passed to them. That's how he can found the college. But obviously he has family, and in essence this is a way of compensating them for not getting any money from him, is that it means that anybody who can prove descent from either of the founders' grandfathers could claim, provided they were suitably qualified, could claim one of these 6 fellowships that were reserved for founders' kin. And so they had to prove their descent. So we get some nice pedigrees here. This one is from about 1607, is the pedigree of John Abington, who is right at the bottom here, who is trying to prove that he is descended from, if we jump to the top. Here is our founder, Sir Thomas White. Here's his mother and his maternal grandfather. Confusingly, his paternal side, of course, is the White family. His maternal side is the Kibblewhite family. So here is his grandfather, Kibblewhite, who had 3 daughters, one of whom, Marie, here is his mother. And so he's showing how he's come down from, descended from the founder's aunt, who marries Thomas Waldron. And the other way they're authenticating this, if we jump to the bottom, you've got the various coats of arms. As you can see, there's various Waldrons signing here who are family members saying, yep, I know this to be true. And then you have this figure here, who is Richard St. George, Norroy King of Arms. So this is one of the heralds, who you might remember seeing with massive tabards at various balconies proclaiming the king 2 years ago. One of them would be the Norroy King of Arms. The post will still exist. And so here we have one of the heralds also authenticating this. Sadly, John Abington doesn't seem to have become a fellow, so presumably there were better qualified people with equally good family trees. Now, I will come back to these pedigrees in just a minute, but another major source that we have are account books, which your heart might think slightly when I say that, but they're much more interesting than they initially sound. And we have the annual accounts, known as the Computus Annui, which is simply Latin for annual accounts, going back almost to the beginning of the foundation. So the earliest we have is this book of 1568, so about 10 years after the college was really up and running. And as you can see, this has had some rather nasty water damage at some point. Long before, I hasten to add, I took over custody of it, probably by a century or more. This again is smaller than it actually looks here, and the handwriting is incredibly difficult to read. But what's nice about the St John's accounts, compared to many colleges, it actually lists all the fellows and all the students. So here we have the stipends paid to the fellows, and here we have their battles, that rather obscure Oxford term for the bills that are generated for students in college. Nobody knows why they're called battles, but they have been for centuries. Just to give you a bit of a close-up on the left-hand side, here you can see the Solutionis Stipendium of the Socii, which is the Latin for we use for fellows, and it's done in very formal order, starting always with the president, vice president. The college is still young, so there are no doctors yet, but a doctor would be right at the top. Then you get the masters, so people who've taken their MA, and you can see they're called Mr. Martin, that bottom one we saw earlier, Gregory Martin, the Bible translator. Then we get down to this here, which is DS for Dominus, which we would normally translate as Lord now, but here I think is Sir. If you read Chaucer, you sometimes get Sir Thomas the Priest or something, and so it's more of a courtesy title than an actual knighthood. But this is representing people who've done the Bachelor of Arts course, and then you get the people at the bottom with just surnames who are still undergraduates, because St John's was very odd right through until the statutes were rewritten in the 1860s, that the fellows, on being elected from their schools, came here as undergraduates, and were still technically a fellow while an undergraduate. And I've just picked out one name for you there, underlined in red near the top, is Mr. Campion. This is St Edmund Campion, who was the protege's founder. He read the homily at the founder's funeral, and is probably the most famous of the Elizabethan martyrs, stroke traitors, depending on your perspective, who was hung, drawn and quartered. And he was a fellow of the college, as seen here, up until about 1570, when he went to Ireland and became a Jesuit priest. So of the 40 martyrs who were officially canonised by the Catholic Church in 1970, at least 2, possibly 3, were members of St John's. And Cuthbert Main, who was the chaplain, he's never a fellow, but he was a chaplain here at this time, was the proto-martyr, meaning he was the first of them to be martyred, stroke executed, again, depending on your point of view. But to take the accounts forward a bit, this is a very small book, but they become what we sometimes are known as the long book, as you can understand from the size of this. This is from 1790, and again it's doing exactly the same we've just seen. This, I think, is the battles of the Sociorum, so the fellows, and just to give you a bit of a glimpse in here, again you can see the masters, the bachelors now have SR for Sir, and then the undergraduates. And again, I've picked out 2 names here, Master Austin near the top, and just Austin down nearer the bottom. James at the top and Henry at the bottom, Austin, both fellows of the college, and again, founders' kin. Here we have their, slightly less attractive than the last one, but their pedigree, in which James Austin shows his descent from Sir Thomas White's sister, Mary, at the top, and their father, White, there, and Mary and her husband, John Bridgman. Now, some of you might already have guessed where this is going, but if James and Henry Austin are founders' kin, then it means their sister, Jane Austen, is, if I've calculated this right, the 7 times great niece of the founder. Now, obviously, Jane Austen was unable to take up that offer, even though it's through the maternal line, as you can see through her mother Cassandra. Her father George was also a fellow of the college, but he got that because he attended Tonbridge School, which had one place reserved as a fellow. And my theory is that he met Cassandra's brother, who was a student here at the same time, and that therefore, perhaps this is a bit too much, but that we as St John's can claim the credit for the very existence of Jane Austen. But this is the account book for the building of Canterbury Quad. And if you haven't seen Canterbury Quad yet, do make sure you visit before you go. It is the most attractive quad in Oxford. That's a fact. It was basically it was paid for by William Laud, who was president here 1611 to 21, then moved swiftly up the hierarchy to become Bishop of London and Archbishop of Canterbury. So it's the profits of those two dioceses that paid for it. If you're not aware of Laud, he arguably did more than anybody else to start the civil wars in the 1640s and 50s by trying to impose the prayer book on the Scottish Church, which is basically what kicked everything off. We're obviously very pleased about him, and he is buried with the founder under the high altar. He was executed by Parliament in 1645. But he did build this magnificent quadrangle, and this is some of the accounts paying for it. If we go, this is the very last page, if we go right to the bottom, you can see the total cost, and bear in mind this is the 1630s, is £5,500, so £5,553, 7 shillings and 5 pence. And even just here, you can see £400 was paid for the brass statues of Charles I and Henrietta Maria that you'll see looking at each other over the two corridors. So in 1636, the building was finished, and also Laud by now was Chancellor of the university, excuse me. He had introduced new statutes for the university that essentially survived on how the university was run for another 2 centuries. And to celebrate his achievements, he held a party in Canterbury Quad, which the King and Queen and the entire court came to. This is in his personal accounts, which are in the National Archives rather than with us. But the party cost £2,666, so half as much as the actual building had cost. So that would have been quite something. I will just race through a few more things. By the time we get into the 19th and 20th century, we start to get more material about the fellows and the students, including lots of photographs, most of which are photographs of the college rugby team or the debating society and so forth. But I thought I'd just show you this rather splendid early photograph from the 1860s of the fellowship. I particularly love the stovepipe hat right at the centre, and the chap on the right who couldn't keep still for long enough and has got a blurred face. But I should just pick out a few people here. Right in the centre here is the Reverend Philip Winter, whose wife, I suspect, might have made this. He was president from 1828 to 1872, and he was very much an evangelical. So he was very much against the Tractarian movement. It was when he was Vice-Chancellor that Dr. Pusey was disciplined by the university. And the legend has it, and I feel slightly awkward as an archivist talking merely about college legend, rather than have something to show you to back it up. But if you haven't seen them, do head on down that way to Garden Quad, where we have a really impressive collection of late medieval church vestments. They're better than it sounds. It's well worth a look. And allegedly, he allowed his children to use them for playing charades and chopped up the cope chest for firewood. Who knows, but it's plausible. Over his left shoulder is James Bellamy, who replaced him as president and was president from 1872 to 1909. So between the two of them, they were presidents for over 80 years. And Winter's predecessor had become president in, I think, 1795, so there were just 3 over the whole of the 19th century. And as one might expect, with that sort of lack of change at the top, it's not surprising that St John's in the 19th century was infamous as the most conservative college in Oxford. And Bellamy apparently founded the Non-Platchett Society, which is what you said in congregation if you disagreed with something, to fight reform throughout the university. One other person I will point out is over President Winter's other shoulder, over his right shoulder, and we have a better picture of him here. And you might think you recognise him. This is the Reverend Edward Palin, who is a fellow of the college from 1843 to 66. He is the great-grandfather of Michael Palin, who looked exactly like that, of course, in his Monty Python years. And some of you might be aware or have read his recent book about his great-uncle Harry, and this is Harry's father. That's in the book, along with a picture Michael has in his collection, which shows him as an older man. And just one more thing to end with. Another thing we have about the students is the JCR suggestion book. Now, the idea was you would comment on things here, and the JCR secretary would reply. And the idea was you were meant to sort of put in suggestions and be helpful. Most of it does end up as rather smutty poetry, like this bit at the bottom. So I shall move on very quickly from that to the bit at the top, which says, is there any reason, unknown to uninitiated freshmen, why the bloody JCR clock is always approx a quarter of an hour fast? Yours, etc., P.A. Larkin. So this is Philip Larkin, and I think it's rather nice that, I mean, obviously famously quite a miserable poet. He once gave a read in the college when somebody asked, why is your poetry so depressing? And he said, I didn't invent death and middle age, you know. And here, as a very young man, we get a sense of that feeling.
Did you get a reply?
Marvellous, isn't it? But he has put, peculiar enough, it seems correct now, thanks to the appropriate quarters, P. Larkin. I forget what the other ones were, but I found at least one more of a similar vein, shall we say.